History is usually measured in battles, treaties, and kings. But throughout the entire existence of the human race, there is only one man whose lust for death was so vast that it actually changed the climate of the earth. In the 13th century, an empire rose from the silence of the steppes to consume the world. They didn't just conquer, they exterminated. They wiped out entire civilizations so thoroughly that forests grew back over the ruins, scrubbing 700 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere. This army killed 11% of the world's population at the time. If we translate that to today's numbers, that would be nearly 800 million people slaughtered. Not by nuclear bombs, not by machine guns, and not by drone strikes. They did it by sword, by bow, and by sheer animalistic brutality. This is not a story of a hero. This is the story of the closest thing to the apocalypse the human race has ever seen. This is the story of Genghis Khan. To understand the monster, you must first understand the cage that forged him. Mongolia in the 12th century was not a country. It was a hellscape. Temperatures frequently plunged to 40 degrees below zero. There was no agriculture, no cities, and absolutely no law. There was a perpetual cycle of theft and murder. Men did not fight for land. They fought for survival. You stole your neighbor's cattle to eat. You stole your neighbor's women to breed. In that place, if you showed weakness, you died. If you showed mercy, you died faster. Intotis Midgrinder, a boy was born in the year 1162. Legend says that when he emerged from his mother's womb, his tiny fist was clenched tight. When the midwife pried his fingers open, she gasped in horror. The baby was holding a clot of blood the size of a knucklebone, dark and thick. The tribe's shaman delivered a chilling prophecy. This child is born to kill. They named him Temujin. Temujin's childhood ended abruptly at the age of 9. His father, a powerful tribal chief named Yasuge, was poisoned by rival Tatars during a feast. In a civilized world, Temujin would have inherited his father's title. But on the steppe, power is taken, not given. The tribe looked at the grieving widow and her 7 orphan children and saw only dead weight. They did something cruel, even by their standards. They packed up their yurts and left. They abandoned the family in the middle of the brutal winter, with no food, no horses, and no protection. The 9-year-old boy ran after the departing caravan, screaming, but his cries were met only by the howling wind and the cold indifference of the men who had once sworn loyalty to his father. For years, the future ruler of the world lived like a rat. He ate wild garlic, roots, marmots, and anything he could scavenge to keep from starving. But starvation does strange things to a boy's mind. It strips away humanity and leaves only the predator. As food became scarce, Temujin's older half-brother, Begder, began to bully the younger children, hoarding the little food they found. In the hierarchy of the family, Begder was asserting himself as the alpha male. But Temujin had decided that he would never, ever accept being the beta. He didn't challenge his brother to a fistfight. He didn't complain to his mother. At the age of 13, Temujin committed his first cold-blooded murder. Together with his younger brother, he stalked Begder like a wolf hunting a deer. They approached him from 2 sides, in the tall grass, bows drawn. When Begder fell, dying in the dirt, he didn't beg for his life. He only asked that they spare his full brother. Temujin walked away, leaving the body to rot. When his mother screamed at him, calling him a destroyer, Temujin said nothing. He had learned the most important lesson of his life. The problem is not the conflict. The problem is the enemy. Remove the enemy, and the problem vanishes. But the boy's reputation for brutality began to spread, and that made him a target. The Taisia tribe, the same men who had abandoned his family years earlier, they feared this wolf child would grow up to seek revenge. They captured him, but instead of killing him instantly, they chose to torture him. They locked his head and hands in a heavy wooden collar, called the kang. It was an instrument designed for humiliation and pain. For months, perhaps years, Temujin lived with his heavy wood crushing his shoulders, eating scraps thrown to dogs, and beaten for the amusement of the guards. A lesser man would have broken. A lesser man would have accepted his fate as a slave. But Temujin was biding his time. One night, during a feast, his guards got drunk. Temujin used the very instrument of his torture, the heavy wooden collar, to smash the skull of his guard. He ran into the darkness, submerging himself in the freezing river water, keeping only his nose above the surface while the hunters rode past him. He survived, and the moment he rose from that freezing water, he realized a brutal truth of the steppe. You are either the anvil or the hammer. Temujin decided to become the hammer that would smash the world. By the time he was 16, Temujin began to gather a small following. He reclaimed his betrothed wife, Bort. For a brief moment, it seemed he might settle for a normal life. But the steppe does not forgive. The Merkit tribe, old enemies of his father, attacked their camp at dawn. In the chaos, Temujin made a calculated, cold decision that is still debated by historians today. He jumped on a horse and fled to save himself, leaving his young wife Bort behind to be captured by the enemy. Was it cowardice? Or was it ruthless pragmatism? Temujin knew a dead husband could not save a wife. He needed an army. He went to his father's old allies. He begged, he bargained, and he raised a force. Then he returned. This was Temujin's first true war. They slaughtered the Merkits. Staining the grass red, he found Bort, but she was pregnant, likely with the child of a Merkit rapist. In a move that shocked his society, Temujin accepted the child as his own. He was building loyalty. He was showing the world that he played by a different set of rules. Victory broke power, and power broke rivalry. Temujin and his childhood blood brother Jamuka slowly became mortal enemies. Jamuka represented the old ways, aristocracy, noble birth, and tradition. Temujin represented only one thing: ability. This was Temujin's revolution. He didn't care who your father was. He didn't care if you were a shepherd or a slave. If you were loyal, and if you could kill, you rose in his ranks. He broke the traditional tribal structures. He mixed men from different clans into units of 10, called the *Arban*. They lived together, ate together, and his rule was simple. If one man fled in battle, the other 9 would be executed. Systematically, he destroyed the rival tribes. The Tatas, the Karets, the Namans. The Namans, unlike other Khans who looted and left, Temujin executed the enemy aristocrats, but spared the common soldiers, absorbing them into his own army. His war machine grew like a snowball of death rolling down a mountain, consuming everything in its path. By the year 1206, the impossible had happened. The Mongolian steppe fell silent. There were no more clan wars, because there were no more enemies left to kill. All the tribes were united under one banner, at a massive council called the Kurultai on the banks of the Anan River. Thousands of white banners waved in the wind. Temujin stepped onto a raised platform and shed his birth name. The shamans and generals knelt before him, proclaiming his new title. A title that meant Oceanic Ruler or King of the Universe. From that moment on, the world no longer knew Temujin. They only knew the name that would haunt the nightmares of humanity for the next 800 years. Genghis Khan. But the steppe was not enough. To keep this massive killing machine from turning on itself, it needed fresh meat, it needed gold. It needeth what? Genghis turned his gaze south, toward the golden cities of China, where civilization lay fat and unsuspecting. The world was about to end, and the devil had just mounted his horse. In 1211, the world witnessed a collision that should have been impossible. It was a clash between the past and the future, between the primitive and the advanced. On one side stood the Jin dynasty of northern China, civilization of 50 million people, boasting towering stone cities, gunpowder, silk, poetry, and infinite wealth. On the other side stood Genghis Khan and his horde, 100,000 illiterate horsemen who had never seen a stone wall in their lives, smelling of stale milk and dried blood. By all logic, the Chinese should have crushed these barbarians like ants. The Jin had an army of nearly 1 million men. They had the Great Wall. They had the mandate of heaven, but they had made a fatal mistake. They treated Genghis Khan like a nuisance, a bandit to be swatted away. They didn't realize they were staring into the eyes of a military genius who was rewriting the laws of war. The invasion began not with a battle, but with an insult. When the Jin emperor demanded that Genghis bow to receive an imperial edict, the Khan didn't kneel. He turned his horse around, spat on the ground in the direction of the south, and shouted, "I thought the Emperor of Heaven should be a man of the sky." Why is an imbecile like you sitting on the throne? It was a declaration of total war. But Genghis had a problem. The Mongols were masters of the open field, but they were useless. Against walls, the Chinese cities were fortresses, surrounded by moats and stone ramparts 40 feet high. A horse cannot jump a wall. An arrow cannot pierce stone. So Genghis Khan did what he always did. He adapted, and the method he chose was pure psychological terror. The first victim was the Western Xia kingdom. When the Mongols reached the fortified capital, they couldn't break in. Genghis tried to be clever. He engineered a plan to divert a nearby river to flood the city. It was a disaster, though. Mongols botched the engineering and flooded their own camp instead. But the sheer audacity of the attempt terrified the Western Xia king so much that he surrendered anyway. Genghis didn't just take the city, he took their engineers. He captured the Chinese experts who knew how to build catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams. He absorbed their technology. Now, the wolf had learned how to use a machine gun. With his new siege engines, Genghis turned toward the true prize, the Jin dynasty and the city of Zhongdu modern day. Beijing. The path to Beijing was blocked by the Badger's Mouth, a narrow mountain pass where the Jin army had amassed a massive force to slaughter the Mongols. The Jin commander was confident. He had the high ground. He had the numbers. But Genghis Khan sent his suicide squad to attack the front line, drawing the Chinese in, while his main force flanked them through a path the Chinese thought was impassable. What followed at the Badger's Mouth wasn't a battle. It was an industrial-scale slaughter. The Mongols butchered the Jin army so thoroughly that, decades later, travelers passing through the region reported that the ground was still white with human bones. The rotting corpses were piled so high they formed hills that blocked the road. The air was so thick with the smell of decay that horses refused to eat the grass. With the army destroyed, the countryside lay open. The Mongols didn't just march. They unleashed a campaign of terror designed to break the mind of the enemy before they even reached the gates. This is where the darkest chapter of Mongol warfare began. As they approached the fortified cities, the Mongols employed a tactic that is difficult to comprehend in its cruelty. They would round up thousands of local peasants' women, children, the Eryand, force them to march in front of the Mongol army. Human shields. When the Chinese defenders on the walls looked down, they didn't see Mongol warriors. They saw their own mothers, their own sons, their own neighbors screaming for mercy. If the defenders shot their arrows, they killed their own people. If they didn't shoot, the Mongols would use the cover of the screaming crowd to push their battering rams against the gates. It was a checkmate of horror. By 1214, Genghis Khan stood before the magnificent walls of Zhongdu, Beijing. The city was a marvel of engineering, with walls stretching for miles. But Genghis didn't need to knock the walls down. He just needed to wait. He encircled the city. Nothing went in. Nothing came out. Inside the walls, the glorious capital of the north slowly turned into a living hell. First, the food ran out. Then, the horses and dogs were eaten. And then, the silence of the city was broken by a darker hunger. Historical records from the siege describe scenes of nightmare. The starving citizens began to eat the dead. Markets were set up where human flesh was sold openly. It was said that parents would swap children with neighbors so they wouldn't have to kill and eat their own offspring. Disease ran rampant. The city was rotting from the inside out. When the Jin emperor finally fled, leaving the city to its fate, the morale collapsed. In 1215, the gates were opened. The Mongols rode in. What happened next was not a looting. It was an erasure. The city burned for a solid month. The smoke was so thick, it blocked out the sun for weeks. The Mongols, furious at the long resistance, spared no one. They raped, they pillaged, and they massacred with a mechanical efficiency. A year later, an ambassador from a foreign land visited the ruins of Beijing. He wrote that the streets were slippery with human fat. He described seeing a giant white mountain outside the city walls. When he got closer, he realized it wasn't a mountain of stone. It was a pyramid of skulls. The golden kingdom of the Jin had been brought to its knees. Genghis Khan had proven that civilization, with all its art and walls and philosophy, was fragile. All it took to break it was hunger and fear. But as the smoke rose from the ruins of Beijing, Genghis Khan did not smile. He did not settle down to rule in the palaces he had just conquered. He hated the soft life of the city. He took the gold, the silk, and the artisans, and he turned his horse back toward the grasslands. He thought he was done. He thought he could return to the steppe and live out his days as the master of the East. But fate had other plans. Far to the west, in the Islamic world of the Khwarezmian Empire, a foolish sultan was about to make the biggest mistake in history. He was about to insult the devil, and the devil was still hungry. By the year 1218, Genghis Khan was tired of war. Was Ahin. He had conquered the East, brought China to its knees, and united the steppe. He desired trade, not blood. He looked toward the west, to the vast and wealthy Khwarezmian Empire, the heart of the Islamic Golden Age. This was a land of scholars, poets, astronomers, and magnificent blue-tiled cities like Bukhara. And Genghis sent a massive trade caravan of 450 men to the city of Otrar, carrying gold silk and a message of peace to Sultan Muhammad II. The message read, "I am the master of the lands of the rising sun, and you are the master of the lands of the setting sun. Let there be a firm treaty of friendship and peace between us." It was the most generous offer the Sultan would ever receive, and he spat on it. The governor of Otrar, a greedy man named Inalhuk, accused the merchants of being spies. With the Sultan's permission, he seized their goods and butchered all 450 men. Only one survivor escaped to carry the news back to Genghis Khan. When Genghis heard the news, he didn't scream. He didn't rage. Went silent. For 3 days and 3 nights, he climbed to the top of a sacred mountain called Birkenkohl. He took off his hat, loosened his belt, and beat his head against the ground, praying to the eternal blue sky. When he descended on the 4th day, his eyes were burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. He told his generals, "I have not sought this war. The Sultan has chosen death. Now, let us give it to him." This was no longer a conquest for land. This was a blood feud. In 1219, the Mongol Horde arrived. But this wasn't the ragged band of raiders from before. This was a disciplined machine of 200,000 horsemen, accompanied by the siege engineers captured from China. They moved across the Kaisilkum Desert like a sandstorm. The first target was Otrar, the city where the trade caravan had been murdered. The siege lasted 5 brutal months. When the walls finally fell, the slaughter was absolute. Genghis ordered that every soldier be killed and every civilian be enslaved. But for Governor Inalhuk, the man who had started it all, Genghis had reserved a special nightmare. Legend tells that Genghis dragged the governor before him in the ruins of the city. He asked, "You like my silver so much? You wanted my gold." He then ordered his guards to melt down a pot of silver. While the metal was searing hot, liquid and glowing, they poured it into the governor's eyes and ears. The man died screaming. His greed solidified inside his skull. But Otrar was just the appetizer. The main course was the jewel of the Islamic world, Bukhara. When the Mongols arrived at Bukhara, a garrison of 20,000 soldiers fled in terror, leaving the civilians defenseless. Genghis rode his horse straight into the city's great mosque. He climbed up into the pulpit, the place where the imams preached the word of God. He looked out at the trembling scholars and aristocrats huddled on the floor, and he delivered one of the most chilling speeches in human history. He said, "O people, know that you have committed great sins. If you ask me what proof I have for these words, I say it is because I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Then the cleansing began. The Mongols didn't just kill people, they killed the culture. They took the priceless Qurans and manuscripts from the libraries and used them as litter for their horses. They turned the mosques into stables. They raped women in front of their husbands and fathers. Then they set the city on fire. Bukhara, a city that had stood for centuries as a beacon of learning, was reduced to a flat plain of ash. Next fell Samarkand. Then, at Urgench, the resistance was fierce, so the Mongol retaliation was mathematically precise. After the victory, each Mongol soldier was assigned a quota. They were required to execute 24 civilians each. With an army of huge numbers, this meant that nearly 1.2 million people were slaughtered in a matter of days. The irrigation dams were destroyed, changing the course of rivers so that they flowed over the ruins of the cities, washing away the blood and the bodies, erasing the very existence of the people who once lived there. It was said that the Mongols killed so many people that the pyramids of severed heads stood higher than the city walls. Sultan Muhammad II, the man who had arrogantly provoked the beast, spent his final days running like a frightened dog. Genghis sent 2 of his best generals, Sabbatai and Jib, with orders to hunt him down to the ends of the earth. The Sultan fled from city to city, but everywhere he went, the Mongols followed, burning everything in their wake. He finally died alone, in rags, on a small island in the Caspian Sea, shivering from pneumonia and fear. But the death of the Sultan did not stop the horde. The momentum of the slaughter was too great. Genghis Khan looked further west. He saw Russia. Sau Europe. The punishment of God was not finished yet. As the smoke cleared over the dead empire of Khwarezm, a new terrifying reality dawned on the world. The Mongols had destroyed the buffer between the east and the west. There was now nothing standing between the Mongol sword and the princes of Europe. The apocalypse was moving west, while Genghis Khan was erasing the Islamic world from the map. He unleashed his 2 dogs of war, his greatest generals, Sabbatai and Jiban. A mission that sounds like fiction. He told them, "Go west. Ride until you reach the sea. Tell me what is out there." With only 20,000 men, Sabbatai and Jib embarked on the greatest cavalry raid in military history. They circled the Caspian Sea, crushing the kingdom of Georgia and destroying their heavy knights. Then they crossed the Caucasus Mountains into what is now Ukraine. There, they encountered a new enemy. The Kievan, their ancestors of modern Russia. The Russian princes, dressed in heavy chainmail and wielding straight European swords, looked at the small Mongol horses and laughed. They saw a horde of dirty nomads. They assembled a massive coalition of 80,000 men to crush this Mino nuisance. In 1223, at the Kalka River, east met west. The Russians charged. The Mongols did what they always did. They ran away. 4 days, the Mongols retreated, firing arrows backward, luring the heavy Russian knights deeper and deeper into the steppe, stretching their lines, exhausting their horses. Then, Sabbatai stopped. He turned the horse heads around. The trap snapped shut. In a matter of hours, the elite knighthood of Russia was annihilated. The Mongols didn't fight with honor. They fought with geometry. They flanked, encircled, and butchered. But the true horror happened after the battle. The Mongol tradition forbade the spilling of royal blood on the ground. They believed it was a spiritual offense. So, when they captured the surviving Russian princes, Sabbatai devised a method of execution that respected their superstition but maximized the cruelty. The Mongols dug a large, shallow pit. They tied up the Russian princes and threw them into it, alive and screaming. Then, they laid heavy wooden planks across the top of the pit, covering the men completely. Sabbatai and his generals then set up their victory feast on top of the planks. As the Mongols drank fermented mare's milk and ate roast mutton, they sat on the wooden floor. Beneath them, the Russian princes were slowly crushed and suffocated by the weight of the celebration. The Mongols laughed and sang songs of victory, their rhythm kept by the cracking of ribs and the muffled screams coming from the earth beneath their boots. It was a feast of bones. Having terrified Europe, the dogs of war returned home. They had proven that nothing in the West could stop them. But back in Mongolia, the great Khan was running out of time. Genghis was now in his 60s. The years of sleeping in the saddle and the brutal winters were taking their toll. Yet, he had one loose end to tie up. The Western Xia Kingdom, the first enemy he had ever fought, had refused to send troops for his western campaign. They had betrayed him. Genghis Khan mobilized his army for his final war. It was a campaign of total extermination. He gave a simple order. He erased them, and his army obeyed. They destroyed the Western Xia so completely that their language and culture virtually disappeared from history. We only know they existed because of the Mongol records of their destruction. But during this campaign, in 1227, the end finally came. The official history says Genghis Khan fell from his horse while hunting, suffering internal injuries. Some legends say he was castrated by a Tangut princess he was trying to rape. Others say he died of illness. The truth is irrelevant. The Titan was dead. On his deathbed, Genghis Khan gave his final, terrifying order. He did not ask for a monument. He did not ask for a pyramid. He asked for oblivion. He said, "Do not let my death be known until the enemy is destroyed, and let no man know where I sleep." The funeral procession of Genghis Khan is perhaps the bloodiest funeral in human history. His body was placed on a wagon and carried back to the sacred mountain of Burkhan-Khaldun. But to keep the location a secret, the royal guards accompanying the cart killed every single living thing they passed. If they passed a village, they slaughtered the village. If they passed a lone shepherd, they cut his throat. If they passed a bird in the sky, they shot it down. Men, women, children, livestock and Sioux were sacrificed to ensure that no witness remained to point a finger and say, "The Khan went that way." When they reached the burial site, deep in the forbidden zone, they buried him in an unmarked grave. According to legend, they drove 1,000 horses over the ground repeatedly until the earth was flat and the grass was trampled into mud. They planted a forest of trees over the spot. Some accounts even say they diverted a river to flow over the tomb, sealing him under the water forever. Then, the final purge began. The soldiers who buried Genghis Khan were killed by a second group of soldiers waiting further down the mountain. Then, that second group of soldiers was killed by the royal guard when they returned to the capital. The secret was sealed in blood. To this day, despite modern technology, satellites, and archaeologists searching for centuries, the tomb of Genghis Khan has never been found. The man who conquered the world vanished into the earth, leaving only his shadow over history. But as the dirt settled over his grave, the world made a fatal mistake. They thought the nightmare was over. They thought that without the genius of Genghis, the Mongol Empire would crumble. They were wrong. Genghis had left behind 4 sons, and he had left behind a machine of government, a code of law, and an army that knew only one thing: expansion. His 3rd son, Agide, took the throne. He was not the warrior his father was, but he was ambitious. He looked at the map that his father had drawn, and he pointed his finger at the one place Genghis had never finished conquering. He pointed at Europe. The scouts had returned. The path was clear, and the full might of the Mongol Empire was about to descend on the knights of Christendom. The apocalypse wasn't ending, it was just entering its second act. By 1241, the grandson of the wolf, Agade Khan, sat on the throne. He was not a warrior like his father. He was a drunkard, often passing out with a cup of wine in his hand, but he possessed his father's ambition, and he possessed Subhatai, the greatest military genius the world has ever known. Subhatai looked at the map of the world and pointed a withered finger at the knights of Europe. The order was given: ride to the Great Sea. Europe was completely unprepared. The Pope and the kings of Christendom were too busy fighting amongst themselves to notice the storm gathering in the Isa dismissed the rumors of devil's horsemen as pagan myths. They believed their stone castles and heavy iron armor made them invincible. They were wrong. In the spring of 1241, the Mongols launched a 2-pronged attack that displayed a level of coordination modern armies would envy. They struck Poland and Hungary simultaneously, despite the armies being separated by hundreds of miles. First came Poland. At the Battle of Legnica, the flower of European chivalry gathered to stop the beast. The Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, and the Polish nobility men who had spent their entire lives training for war lined up in glistening steel armor. They charged the Mongols with the blessing of God. But the Mongols didn't fight with chivalry. They fought with chemistry. Historical records suggest the Mongols used a form of smoke screen burning, foul-smelling substances, and using pyrotechnics to confuse the knights. Blinded by smoke and panic, the heavy European cavalry was separated and slaughtered. The Mongols didn't want prisoners. They wanted proof of victory. After the battle, the Mongol commanders didn't bother counting bodies. They simply ordered their troops to cut an ear off every corpse. They filled 9 glorious sacks with human ears and sent them back to the Khan as a gift. While Poland was burning, the main Mongol force smashed into Hungary. At the Battle of Mohi, the Hungarian king Balafor thought he was safe behind a fortified bridge. But in the dead of night, the Mongols used their Chinese siege engineers to bombard the bridge with stone throwers' artillery fire in the 13th century. Under the cover of the noise, they crossed the river. The result was a massacre so complete that it depopulated the country. It is estimated that 50% of the entire population of Hungary died that year. The plains were so covered in corpses that the wolves could not eat them all. By the winter of 1241, the road to the Atlantic was open. The Hungarian army was dead. The Polish army was dead. The Mongols stood at the gates of Vienna. There was no army left in Europe capable of stopping them. The path to Germany, France, and Italy was clear. The Mongols were scouting the valleys, preparing to burn Paris and Rome. It seemed that Western civilization was about to be extinguished. The Pope prayed for a miracle, and in December 1241, a miracle happened. It didn't come from an army, it came from a bottle. Thousands of miles away, in the capital of Karakorum, the great Khan Agade drank himself to death. During a night of heavy feasting, his heart finally gave out. The Mongol law, the yasa, was absolute. When the great Khan dies, all princes and generals must return to the capital to elect a new leader. If they did not return, they lost their claim to power. Just as the Mongol scouts were looking at the spires of Vienna, a lone rider arrived with the news. Sabbatai, furious that his greatest conquest was being snatched away by fate, obeyed the law. He turned the horses around. The horde withdrew. Europe was saved not by its swords, not by its god, but by a liver failure. The Mongols never returned with the same force. The empire began to fracture into civil wars, but they left a scar on the world that would never heal. Their legacy was not just in the cities they burned, but in the blood they left behind. Genghis Khan and his sons took so many women from so many different lands that a 2003 genetic study revealed a shocking truth. Roughly 0.5% of the world's male population, about 16 million men alive today, carry the direct genetic marker of Genghis Khan. Was the ultimate alpha predator, the father of nations. But they left another, darker gift. In the 1340s, as the Mongol Empire maintained trade routes between East and West, they allowed safe passage for merchants. But along with the silk and spices, something else traveled down the Silk Road. Fleas. Historians believe that the Pax Mongolicata Mongol peace facilitated the rapid spread of the Black Death. The plague that would kill half of Europe traveled on the very roads the Mongols built. In a way, the apocalypse that Genghis Khan started was finished by the bacteria he helped unleash. Genghis Khan began as a starving boy clutching a blood clot. He ended as the man who drew the borders of the modern world in ash and bone. He proved that civilization is fragile, that mercy is a choice, and that one man's rage can burn the world. The Mongols are gone. The yurts have rotted away. But the next time you feel a cold wind blowing from the east, remember, we are all just the descendants of the survivors. If you survived this journey through history's darkest empire, make sure to like and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the forbidden orgies of ancient Rome. Sleep well, if you can.